Last week, we talked about Augustine and Plato's influence on St. Augustine, and St. Augustine's writing of the City of God and how that influenced medieval society, up to and through medieval society. Today, we're going. Oh, you can go to the next one. Right. Yeah. Go one more. Go one more. Okay. So then we went and talked about medieval art forms. We talked about the icons, how the icons were more devotional than they were considered artworks, because they helped one. As you remember, I explained, when you look at an icon, you actually are entering into a window, and then in your heart and mind, you're in front of the person, right? So it had more devotional aspect. It wasn't, the artists weren't trying to imitate nature. They were trying to catch the essence of the person. They weren't trying to imitate or to try to capture the physical image of the person. They wanted the spiritual image. Then, well, this week we're going to go to Aristotle's influence on St. Thomas and how Aquinas used Aristotelian philosophy to reach religious truths. This new approach to the Church's teachings would set in motion societal changes. In other words, society and life in the medieval times would start to change. And we'll see how that happens. We'll go through that almost step by step. So we move from the Augustinian model of the City of God that we spoke about last week to a new secular-based society. Oh, okay. So Western civilization at this time, when the society was transferring from like the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, was moving from a theocentric society. That means a society that was centered around God and the church. And then to a more humanistic one, where religion and the church would continue to play an important role, but it would shift to a more secular sector of the society. I'm trying to stay within the range of the camera, and it keeps distracting me when I go outside. Okay, so much of this would be also reflected in the art period, because we'll go now from philosophy, how it affected the religious teachings, and then from there we'll see how that affected the artwork, especially the religious art, is what we're really concerned with. So we went from looking at the icons, which were two-dimensional planes. In other words, you have width and height, to a more realistic three-dimensional artwork. And also, the artwork was more imitative of nature. It was also a narrative. In other words, you can look at the art and tell a story. The art was telling a story. And whose goal was to imitate nature and to inform and to teach. Okay. So we looked at the icon. That's the two-dimensional. It's not imitative. It's more of a devotional, to help us to be more devotional. It's not for the sake of the artwork. They weren't trying to capture anything. They weren't trying to imitate nature. There's no narrative there. This here just represents our Blessed Mother, right? And that's it. As a matter of fact, last week, I know Irene had asked about the lettering on the icon of the Blessed Mother, so I did check that out. It was difficult because these lettering are ornate. But checking out, this is what they call the Mu Rho, or the MR, which means Mary, from Maria. And this here, which looks like the Greek Omicron, is really a theta, and this is Epsilon. So this means Mother of God. Okay. Now, the art starts changing into this particular work. This is an illustrative work, those lines that they illustrate, and a little later on, I'll explain the meaning of these particular lines here. This work was done by an artist by the name of Masaccio in the year 420, and it's called Paying the Temple Tax. The tax that's paid here is not a civil tax. It's a tax to support the Temple of Jerusalem. It's a religious tax. So this is, those lines represent what they call linear perspective. I'm going to get into that in a little while, but right now you can just kind of ignore it. I want to focus here on this painting on the narrative. There's a story being told here. And it's in the gospel, if you want to make a note of it, in Matthew chapter 17, 24 to 27. And actually, there's 3 separate parts to this painting. And they're all represented in those verses of Matthew 17. This here, it tells the story of the tax collector saying to Peter, and I'll just paraphrase, I won't quote exactly the scriptures. He says to Peter, "Does your teacher pay the tax?" Peter said, "Yes." Later on, Christ said to him, Peter, Simon, he used the term, Simon, he said, "What? Who pays the king's tax? The son or others?" And Peter said, "Others." In other words, the son of the kings don't pay the tax. Others. And what Christ was meant by that, because we're going to come back to this painting, now keep this in mind, that he's exempt from the tax. He said, then we're free. Because he's the Son of God. This is the temple tax. That's the house of God, right? Christ made reference to that in several other Gospels when he was found in the temple at 12 years old. "Why were you looking for me? Did you know I was in my Father's house?" All right, so this all references that. From there, Christ says to Peter, drop a fishing line in. The first fish you pull up, open its mouth, you'll find a shekel. The tax was half a shekel. This is Peter over here opening the mouth of the fish. And then the third part of the story is he's paying the tax here. So it's a narrative. It's telling the story. And we didn't have this in the medieval art. You don't have this in the icons. But we have this now developing now. They're trying to imitate nature, to bring in three-dimensional aspect, that third dimension. It's still, by the way, it's still a two-dimensional plane, width and height. The third dimension of depth is just an illusion. The eye, it's a trick of the eye, and we will explain how that happens as we go along. Okay. All right, so let's talk about Aristotle because this is where we're beginning. He's the one that influences this period of history. Aristotle was the most comprehensive of philosophers of antiquity, perhaps of all time. He covered just about everything in the physical world and everything in the metaphysical world. And his works include, he wrote the Physics, which is really writing about the natural world. He wrote Metaphysics, which is written about. Metaphysics is kind of a natural word for the spiritual world, right? Meta means beyond. Metaphysics, beyond the physical. He wrote on ethics. He wrote the Poetics, which was about poetry, drama, comedy, tragedy. He wrote Aesthetics, right? That's about beauty, the philosophy of beauty. He wrote Politics. He wrote about analytics. He wrote about meteorology. He wrote on the heavens, on animals, on dreams. He even wrote about sleepwalking. Hey, that's in a few. And Thomas Aquinas had something to say about most of these things. Aquinas would cover a lot of Aristotle. So as Plato, we saw last week, served as the basis for St. Augustine's teaching, we have Aristotle served Aquinas. Now, Aristotle was the starting point then for the basis of inquiries into these religious or theological truths. Okay. Now, recall the painting, that's the theme, the School of Athens. Could we go back? Yeah. Okay. School of Athens. We looked at this last week. Let's just review it again. This is the theme because we're talking about philosophers here. The School of Athens, Raphael, painted between 1509 and 1511. It hangs in the Vatican, in the 5 rooms of Raphael, which are the room, used to be in the medieval time, the papal apartments. Now it's part of the museum. And it's just a walk a few meters from the entrance into the Sistine Chapel. It was Pope Julius II. It was a study. And this picture hung there. So we have, this is already a Renaissance work, so we have the medieval, we have the depth, as we're going to talk about in a little while. But we could take this picture and cut it in half. So it's one of equal proportions. We have in the center the focal point of the philosopher Plato on our left and Aristotle on the right. And if we divide it right between them, we have the philosophers here who follow the Aristotelian or Aristotle, and on the left, these are the Platonic, or those who follow Plato. Now, some of them were before Aristotle and Plato, but the same theories, the same metaphysics, the same school of philosophical thought. And we'll just name a couple of the people in here that are important. Of course, we have Socrates here on Plato's side, because we know Socrates through Plato. We also have, this is Heraclitus, but he has the face and the dress of Michelangelo, and Raphael did that deliberately. And as a matter of fact, Plato is Leonardo da Vinci's face. And on Aristotle's side, we have, these are what they call the Peripatetics. They're the followers of Aristotle. And we have two geographers here, earth science, right? Because we see that Plato is pointing up. I have a close-up of this, so we'll get to see that. He's pointing up to the metaphysical world. Plato, we remember last week we said that his metaphysics included a world of perfect ideas and forms. And then that world was the perfect world, and the physical material world is the imperfect world. Aristotle has got his hand down to the earth. He's grounded on the earth. The physical sciences, for example. Of course, he has the metaphysical works too, but everything starts from the earth up. We're going to see that. So he has Ptolemy, right, an early geographer who made the earth. He said geocentric earth. Everything revolved around the earth in antiquity. And Strabo, another ancient Greek geographer. Let's see, we have Pythagoras here. And I want to point out this gentleman here. We're going to be talking about him. He's wearing a turban. His name is Averroes. Averroes, his Arabic name is Ibn Rushd. Okay. All right, let's see if we can get back to, keep going. Okay, right there, go back one. Okay, so we recall Raphael's School of Athens. So Plato is pointing upward, as I just said, on the metaphysical world. And in Plato's world, we also mentioned that he discovered through using logic and reason that there was a transcendent one called the Logos. Right? That's where I believe that John got the concept of the Logos, because a heavy Platonic influence during the age of Christ in Palestine, very heavy. There was many efforts made to Hellenize the Jews for about 300 years before Christ and up to the time of Christ. So they knew pretty much about Aristotle, and it had influenced the culture at that time. But then on the other hand, we see Aristotle, his hand is facing down to the earth. So they called, if we went back to the School of Athens again, but don't go back. On the left side, on Plato, we have the metaphysicians. But on the right side, with Aristotle, we have the materialists. That's all going to play a part in here in this progress getting to belief in God. Go ahead, next one. Okay. All right, here's the close-up. We can see Plato pointing up to the metaphysical world. We can see the hands down. All right, they're each carrying works that make reference to that too. Plato is carrying Timaeus, and Aristotle is carrying his ethics, right, which is human behavior. Okay. So Aquinas getting from Aristotle what he called a system of knowledge. And this system of knowledge, Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas got this system from studying Aristotle. He says, all knowledge is one, let me see how we put this out in philosophy. Okay. It's all one universal truth, but it's in a hierarchy, and it starts with on a basis, the base or the foundation of the hierarchy are the sciences. And we know the sciences through observation and the senses. Go to the next one. Okay. Go back again. All right, so the foundation is on the physical science and observation. And we go from there to philosophy. Philosophy rests on the sciences and observation. I have to keep this in mind. This is the physical world. This is Aristotle who's pointing down to the earth. We know the physical science. We go to philosophy, which is reason. You cannot go to philosophy and make an analysis unless you have observed the world around you. Right? We notice some things. We're going to come to this a little later. We notice that everything on earth has a cause, and everything on earth is in motion. And these are the things that make up the earth sciences. Okay? So we know we go to philosophy and we use human reason. And on top of that, we can put metaphysical. In other words, we use human reason. We talked about this last week, how even the Catechism of the Catholic Church says that you can use reason to know God. So we have a metaphysical world that is a spiritual world that you learn from philosophy, not the world of revelation. That would come next. But we'll see that this metaphysical world is somewhat theoretical because we don't know. We can rationalize there's a God, but we don't know who he is, how, and why. Right? So then go to the next one. So it's incomplete, this knowledge, right? That's as far as Aristotle could bring us from the natural world. But Thomas Aquinas, right, having the benefit of revelation, can say we top off this structure, right, the base of the sciences that we know from observation from our senses, philosophy, a metaphysical world. We top it off with theology. Theology can only be known, right, through authoritative or divine revelation. So theology completes and perfects the knowledge. So divine truth, though, cannot be perceived through reason, only through revelation, and revelation is a gift. Okay. Now this was something that I want to reemphasize. There's no contradiction in the knowledge required at any level. What you know from science, what we know from reason, and what we know from revelation, there cannot be any contradiction in any of these. The Catechism, I gave this one, well, I gave two references last week. This one here, paragraph 159, says there can never be any real discrepancy between faith and reason. God cannot deny himself, nor can truth ever contradict truth. So, if you have a contradiction between science and faith, then something is defective. Either your science is defective, or I don't want to say your faith is defective, but the interpretation is defective, right? And we can see this in the church. We have an authoritative body to define the scriptures based on 2,000 years of scholarship, 2,000 years of experience. And some of our Christian brothers, if there's 1,000 people in a congregation, they might have 1,000 different interpretations. So how could they ever come to the truth? Okay, next one. So Aquinas also holds that there's two authorities, a temporal and a spiritual authority. That puts him on a higher plane than Aristotle. Okay. Aquinas, though, also built on Aristotle's ethics. Both of them realized that all of man's actions are based on happiness. Whatever man does, he does it to be happy. Now, some people might argue with that, but if you really think about it, whatever motivates people, even if they're committing a crime or committing a sin, they're trying to satisfy themselves. That's why some of these sins, people are trying to indulge in pleasure, for example, and it become an insatiable desire because they never can find the happiness. You only find the happiness in proper human behavior in an ethical way or in a moral way. That's what Aristotle is, that's what Aquinas is telling us. Okay, but it's based on Aristotle's ethics. As a matter of fact, if you've ever read the Divine Comedy, when Virgil, especially the Inferno, when Virgil is taking Dante through hell, Dante commented about some of the punishments that the sinners were receiving. And Virgil said to him, haven't you read your ethics? In other words, haven't you read Aristotle's ethics? That had to do with the structure of hell and the punishment of sins. Okay. Oh, we got it? All right. let's put this into perspective vis-a-vis last week's lecture. Aquinas came roughly 800 years after Augustine. It's a long time, almost a millennium. Right? But even at that time, there wasn't much more known in Aquinas' time than there was in Augustine's time. So Augustine benefited from the Neoplatonists. They were the ones who revised and brought back Plato. But even 800 years later in Europe, Plato hadn't been fully translated, and Aristotle was only recently translated. This was all new. Okay, we can go. So at that time, roughly, it was less than a century that Aristotle was available in Europe, less than a century before Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas then, by his time, he was teaching at the University of Paris, which was then a Catholic institution, right? All the universities that started in Europe, they were all started from the cathedral schools. So it was the church that gave us the university system. The type of Aristotelian, or that is Aristotle's philosophy, that was taught was known by a school that was called the Averroes. Well, we mentioned Averroes, the Muslim scholar. You see, in Aquinas' time, there were two things the philosophers and theologians had. The first thing was they had Aristotle in translation, but commentaries, the only commentaries they have were written by this Muslim scholar, Averroes. As a matter of fact, he is called the great commentator. Most of them followed, most of the theologians and the philosophers followed the interpretation by Averroes. And these are Christians, right? These are Dominican priests, like St. Thomas was a Dominican. Don Scotus was teaching there, the Franciscan, the one who came out with the formula for the Immaculate Conception, right? He was teaching there at the University of Paris at the time. Albert the Great was teaching there. Most of them were Averroes. However, there were some discrepancies between Averroes' teachings and the teachings of the church. So the Bishop of Paris came up with 15 things that were contradictory to the church's teachings. So he prohibited any more teachings of Averroes. And by the time it got to Rome, the Pope said, let's just eliminate Aristotle and all. And Aquinas said, no, we can reconcile Aristotle's teachings to the church. See, there were three main areas that Averroes taught. Averroes taught that his teachings, by the way, were based on his understanding of Aristotle. So we can't say it's all his fault. It's the way he understood Aristotle. And the one teaching that wasn't consistent, one that the earth was eternal. He said, I got that from Aristotle, right? The other one was that when a soul dies, not when the soul dies, when the body dies, the soul lives, but the body deteriorates. And that, the Arabs believe in the Last Judgment. And I'm going to do lectures on Islam in April. That's my area, really. And they believe that Christ is coming for the Last Judgment. I don't know if you know that, but they do. Muslims believe it. Maybe not the average Muslim, but it's in their teachings, that Christ will come for the Last Judgment among all people. So Averroes said, you'll get a new body. The church said, no, we can't do that. But the other one, he said that, but we believe Aristotle, he wrote this, that the individual soul does not have their own mind. Everyone participates in a universal mind. And the church said, no on that one too. Well, Aquinas was able to refute these points that Averroes made. And it's all part of the Summa Theologia. And he won the argument. And the next one. Okay. So we won the argument. By the way, here's Averroes, the close-up, in the school of Athens. Right, this is Averroes. He's right behind Pythagoras. So he was well respected. He's more respected among Christians and Western philosophers than he is in the Islamic world. Matter of fact, they've excommunicated him a long time ago. If I were to make a guess, and I would call a somewhat educated guess on this, probably Aquinas and Averroes agree on Aristotle about 70% of the time, 70 to 75%, maybe 25 to 30% they were in conflict. So he was a great help. He was the first one to commentate. He's recognized. If you Google the great commentator, it'll come up Averroes with nothing else. Go ahead. Okay, this here is a painting by an artist by the name of Benozzo Gonzoli. I have his name on, I believe, the next slide. And it's the Triumph of St. Thomas. It was painted in 1471. It's 3 tiers to it. Now, there's none of the linear perspective or depth or anything. This was a special painting in a tribute to Aquinas. The top tier, of course, is the heavenly realm. That's I had to squish it down to get in here if it looks a little out of shape. And it's in Latin up there, and it says, Thomas, you have written well about me, under the image of Christ. And the bottom we have the Pope. I believe it's Pope Sixtus IV, and the church leadership. And Aquinas is in the middle with Aristotle on one side and Plato on the right. Okay. However, there's somebody at his feet. Can you make that out? Go to the next slide. Okay, there it is. This Aquinas' feet up there. That's Averroes. All right, so we got a little humor here. And it was 1471. By the way, Benozzo Gonzoli did a lot of paintings for the Medici family in Florence. The Louvre. This is in the Louvre in Paris. Next one. Okay. This is another one. There's several of these paintings to try. I selected this one, though, because it's very much like last week's painting that I showed on the Allegory of Good and Bad Government in Siena. All right, this is similar to it, but I just want to point out a couple things. This one is 110 years older than the first painting. And this is in Florence in the church called Santa Maria Novella. And I picked it because I have another painting there. In case you're ever in Florence, you can see the 2 paintings in that church. Well, here we have Aquinas in the middle again. And on the top, we have the various virtues that we saw in the allegory, almost exactly in the same way that we saw it in the allegory of the good and bad government last week. We have at the top the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. And at the bottom, we have the cardinal virtues, right? Prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Sitting to the right and left of Aquinas are both the evangelists and the prophets from the Old Testament. And down on the bottom, there's 14 personifications. They have the 7 liberal arts, and they have what some say. They don't really know what the other 7 are, but one historian says that's the 7 theological sciences. And I haven't nailed what the 7 theological sciences are. And down on the lower level are just Old Testament representations or equivalents to those other allegories. Okay? However, at Aquinas' feet, there's 3 more representations. And could you go to the next slide? Okay. At his feet, we see Averroes again. This is 100 years before. And we have, on the left, Sabellius. He was a 3rd century heretic who said that there's no Trinity, there's only one God. He was a priest. He said it's just the Father. It's just how God revealed himself as the Father in the Old Testament, as the Redeemer in the New Testament, and in the present day, it's the Holy Spirit. It's called modulism. It was condemned by the church. And on the right is Arius, the one who came out with the Arian heresy, that Christ was a creature. He was created. Right? So we know they're both heretics. So they did consider Averroes a heretic. Okay. Next. All right. So probably what Aristotle, if you're not studying philosophy, but you've heard of Aristotle, you probably heard that he's the one that gave Thomas Aquinas 5 proofs of God. Right? Have you heard that before? Anyone? That Thomas Aquinas come out with 5 proofs of God? Well, they're built on Aristotle's philosophy, as Aristotle actually gave it to us in his metaphysics. Now, basing his method on Aristotle, Aquinas, he proffered these 5 proofs. I want to show these. Go ahead, you can put them up. Here's why. Let's go back to Aquinas' structure or hierarchy of knowledge. All of these are based not on the metaphysical, but on earth. you can see that two of them, we observe. We observe. You can put it in all fives. You can start all five saying, we observe these things. In other words, before you can use your rationalization to prove that there's a God, you have to observe, you have to understand your nature. And I mentioned it earlier, the two things. Things are in motion. Everything has a cause. There's nothing independent. Everything in this world, in this universe, it has a dependency on something else, right? And that's what we build it on. So you see how this Aristotelian philosophy and then Aquinas' different layers of knowledge, we always get back to starting at the basis, the sciences, just observing. You live this life, you observe things, okay? Let's take a quick look. I edited these. I made them shorter because we don't want to, we could spend a whole class on this, right? But we just want to use it for illustrative purposes, right? And just point out a couple things. So we have the argument for motion, and that is all things are in motion, right? The whole universe, weather is in motion, the seasons, the oceans, okay? Life is motion. How many times you said, oh, I remember when I was a kid, now look, they're so old. We all experience this. But we know that if everything is motion, there has to be a mover. But at one point, there has to be a first mover, and it has to be an unmoved mover, right? And that we call God. The argument from efficient causes. Now, we can swap out cause for motion. They're really the same argument, looking at it from a different way. Considering the principle, we could say we observe the principle of cause and effect. So, considering the principle of cause and effect, there must be an initial first cause, and we call this God. I'll give you an example. You've heard of this riddle, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Now, you get some arguing, well, the chicken came first because you need a chicken to make an egg, and somebody says, well, the egg came first because you need an egg to make a chicken. So you argue, and what happens? You're in a vicious circle, right? And what does Aristotle say? How do you solve it? You break the circle. It has to be something else that created it. So if we look at it that way, and you go back and look at motion, but look at cause. If you went back and if you had the time and named everything what it was caused for, you would eventually get back to the primary element. This had to be the first thing, like an atom, something like that. Well, it can't be something physical that made the atom, because then you're in the chicken and the egg again. It has to be something that's not physical, and it has to be something that itself is uncaused. It's logic, and it all comes from observing nature. You say, okay, the next causes are interesting. Possibility. We observe things are contingent. In other words, everything is dependent on something else, and transitory. So everything has a beginning, and everything has an end. That's what it means. You observe that in nature. So there must be some point when nothing existed. When it comes to existence, then, there must be something greater, something that's not contingent. In other words, something that's uncaused, something that's not dependent, right? And everlasting. We call that God. Here's another interesting one. We observe that some things are better than others. So when it comes to existence, something must be the best and the greatest. We call that God. Here's a good one, too, because this one is what we hear a lot. When you hear about the arguments in school today and they say, we want to teach evolution, and evangelical brothers and sisters say, well, that's okay with us, but if you teach design, because design is an important one. Right? Look, it says, concerning the complexities of creation and the mathematical precision of the universe and the complex and harmonious interaction between all existence, there must be a designer. You know, today we have the advantage of sending rocket ships out into space with telescopes on it, going into deep space. And they have sensors on them, and they're picking up sound, images, and sensing chemicals and all, coming back with all this information. We see how intricate the universe is. We have electron microscopes. We can look at the DNA helixes and see how beautiful they are. So we have more about the macrocosm. We know more about the macrocosm of the universe and more about the microcosm, the little invisible little things. And we see how intricate, but how integrated. Here's the thing. They're complex, they're integrated, but they all work together. That's integration. That can't be by chance. It can't be by random. That's what the atheists say. It's all random. It can't be random because it's too perfect. and it goes from the macrocosm to the microcosm, the integration of all these things. Okay, so this was given to us by Aquinas. We also got from Aquinas during the Middle Ages a whole new educational system. In the Middle Ages, the only people being educated were in monastery schools and cathedral schools. They were very small, very basic. The vast majority of people were illiterate. Most of them were the clergy that were getting educated, right? But out of the cathedral schools, which were in the cities, the monastery schools were out in the country, we grew up, the universities grew out of them, I mean. And scholasticism, which you probably heard of, was a method and a system of education. And it was basically set up to teach theology and philosophy. But theology and philosophy really can't be taught unless you have the basis. And the basis are the seven liberal arts. And we call them the Trivium. I don't know if you can see that. The Trivium and the Quadrivium. And they look like complicated words because they're from the Latin. But it's really, each one is made of two words. The first part of both of them is simply the number. Tri, like trivium, is 3, and quad is 4. And the last word is from the simple Latin word via, which means way. So the first one means the 3 ways, and the other one means the 4 ways. And the 3 ways, and they're all related in each category, right? The trivium would be grammar, rhetoric, and dialectics, which is language, oratory, and logic. Teaching logic we're talking about. Okay? The quadrivium is all about math. And I'll explain why I'm bringing this in, how important it is. It's about arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Music is those of you who know music know it's all based on mathematics, right? Numbers. Okay? So, coming from these schools, universities growing up, more and more people were getting educated. With all of this philosophy and all of these principles, the society was now influenced. They weren't always focused on everything built around the cathedral and God and the church in the center. They started going out, using the science, the physics, Aristotle's writing, they were learning it, and that affected the artwork too. Okay. So it began with the unveiling of Aristotle's writings and his emphasis on human reason, physics, the arts and sciences, right? Especially learning through observation. I keep trying to emphasize that. So theology was not neglected, but the sciences were finding more and more practical applications. So we're going to start with another of Masaccio's paintings. We saw the first one, the Tribute Money. We're going to look at one that's earlier. The reason we're going to pick this painting, which is called Santa Trinita, the Holy Trinity, is because it was the first deliberate use of linear perspective. I'll show you how we know that. Go ahead. Okay, this is in Santa Maria Novella, the same one that Second Triumph of Thomas is in. So if you're in Florence, you get to that church, it's near the central station, and you can see both of these paintings, plus a lot of other wonderful and great artwork. It's a Dominican church, too. That's why St. Thomas was kind of featured in it. All right, this, of course, represents the Trinity. The Father, that little white thing is the dove, okay? I don't know if you can see it back there. The Holy Spirit, and then our Lord. On the bottom is Blessed Mother and John. The two people on the outside are patrons. See, they're supposed to be outside the painting, right? Because the painting is supposed to be what's in the archways. But linear perspective, in other words, how can we trick the eye to perceive 3 dimensions? Using lines, they call linear perspective, to what they call the vanishing point. It will become clearer as we go along. Lines can be they're not literally lines. They're anything that lines up, in other words, physical objects in a line that goes to a vanishing point. So in this case, we have what they call the Coffered Ceiling. That ceilings, as you see there, they're reset. It could be wooden paneling, or it could be metal, or it could be marble. Like here, it's a marble one, right? We have it, and you see it creates lines. And if you notice, the lines have they're converging. There's a convergence there coming in. This is the first one, so it's kind of primitive. And it's the only one. You can use, for example, in linear perspective, you can use lines in the floor tilings. Ceiling, you can use walls. The walls come in. Right? They all represent lines, and they bring the eye in and create depth. Also, shadowing creates depth, and also the size of the characters. The characters in front of some of the old paintings, they actually put a grid before they painted, and they said anyone in the first, let's say, quadrant would be so many inches high, and the second one it would be shorter and further, and it gives the impression of depth because it's still a flat surface. Go ahead to the next one. All right, that's just the painting. I just wrote that down. It's in Florence. It was 1425 to 1427. Okay. Next. All right. You see the railroad tracks? Everybody knows this, that if you look down the railroad tracks, they're going to converge. We've got a horizon there. That's good because usually the vanishing point is at the horizon, if there is a horizon in the painting, and they don't always have one. But you have the lines. You ride that train for 100 miles, those tracks will never come together. But your eyes see that. So if you then take these lines and put other objects like buildings or floors, you just bring the lines together. That's what we call bilinear perspective. That's the real world. You observe the real world. You want to put realism in your painting, you just use the techniques. Okay, next one. All right, when they X-rayed Santa Trinita, this is what they found underneath. And if you see these dotted lines, that was in the X-ray. They come and line up exactly with the Coffered Ceiling. So, like I said, it's a little primitive. We're going to see some ones that are almost perfect. But this was underneath. That sketch is what they call a cartoon. That's where the word cartoon comes from. The artists in those days would sketch it out in this manner and then paint it in, see, so that when they look and X-ray it today, they can see what was underneath. And we saw these lines. The vanishing point is down here, which seems a little odd. But this painting, if you're in the church, is higher up. In other words, it would be like the ceiling level, and from that up. So you're actually looking up. And those lines take you right to the Coffered Ceiling, and you feel the depth. Okay. Now, this is a perfect example of linear perspective. And this artwork is used when they teach linear perspective. This is Perugino, Christ handing the keys to the kingdom to Peter. All right, this is really interesting. We'll take a little time on this painting because there's a lot in here. Okay, we have, first of all, perfect balance, harmony, and proportion in this painting. We have a horizon. We have plenty of lines going in, converging, right, on the ground. And we have three nice balanced images in the background. In the center, this here, we know it's an octagonal figure. So we know that's the Temple of Solomon. That is the first temple in Jerusalem. It's not the same temple at Christ, during Christ's life. That's the second temple. This is the first one. And we notice that it's right exactly in the middle, and the doorway is kind of in the middle. Two arches, which they associate with the Arch of Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor. So we have that, the first introducing Christianity, Judaism in the middle, telling us, there's some roots here, right? We have three groupings on the bottom, two on the top, one on the right, one on the left. You see how the characters are proportionately smaller? Right? Because that's what the eye sees. But this is a flat surface. It looks like there's depth here, right? You see the lines converge, and we got a horizon. And those buildings are pretty much at the horizon, very close. There's three Gospels here. This scene is another temple tribute tax that we saw Masaccio's painting. It's the same Gospel there. It's I haven't written down. That's Matthew 17, 24 to 27. Here we have the stoning of Christ. That's from John chapter 8, verses 56 to 59. And here we have Matthew 16 to 19, the handing of the keys. So looking this over, what's the relationship? Well, in the tribute money we saw from looking at the other painting, Christ said, I'm the Son, so I'm free from the tax. Refer to that gospel. I'm free from the tax, but we'll pay it anyway. What is Christ? He's saying, I have the authority. It's all about authority. In the second one, if you're familiar with John's gospel, he said to the Jews that were around him at that time that Abraham is happy to see I'm here. And they said, Abraham? He's been dead for so many years. You're not even 50 years old. How could you see him? And Jesus said what? He said, before Abraham was, I am. And immediately they started stoning him. Remember last week when we talked about the icon of Christ, there were 3 Greek letters, the Omicron, the Omega, and the Omicron, the Omega, and the Nu, and that meant he who is, and I made reference to Genesis when Moses asked God, what is your name? He said, I am who am. As soon as Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am, they knew he was what? Declaring himself God. That's about authority. And what do we see here in the handing of the keys? Jesus is giving Peter the keys. He's handing over the authority. This key, there's the 2 keys. There's the gold key and the silver key that we have on the papal emblem, right, and the coat of arms. This key is directly in the middle. And this key, the gold key, that's the silver key, directly in the middle of that painting. You can cut it right down the middle here. We have the gold key is pointing up and pointing to Christ because that's the key to the gates of heaven. Okay? So there's a lot in this painting. Let's go to the next one. Okay? Here we see it close up. Okay? You see the gold key? That's the key to the kingdom of heaven. This is the key to the earthly powers of the Pope. That's how they interpret it. Okay, and we have the apostles around it and some local people. This is a public act, right? It is a public act. It is a defining act. It's a historical act because this authority going from Peter here goes right to the Pope today. Unbroken chain, documented throughout history. There's no doubt about it. There's no question. There's just so much writing on it, and they actually sit on Peter's tomb. The same people from Peter right down to Francis. Go to the next one. Okay, this shows how the Linnaeus perspective works out. Here's the vanishing point, and sometimes the vanishing point, but this is the focal point. You see how it's in these lines? This is the focus of that painting. Okay, passing of the authority. Next. Okay, where does this painting sit? Anyone recognize this? Sistine Chapel. Sistine Chapel, that's right. Okay, here's where it is. Right there. You see Michelangelo's ceiling. Sistine Chapel has this screen across it. About 2/3 of it, or yeah, 3/4, is on this side, and right here would be in our back would be the great Michelangelo's Last Judgment, and on the other side is about 1/4. When the conclave of cardinals meet to elect a new pope, and that pope is elected, then he has to change from his cardinal's clothes into his, they call it the house dress of the Pope, which is the white cassock and the others. And where do they put that dressing room up? Right under that painting. I don't know if they still do it today, but in those days they did. The passing of the new Pope, right under the authority that comes right down. It's symbolic, right? But it's really a powerful symbol, I think, of authority, and that painting a lot. Okay, now we want to talk a little about another artist. We're going to switch to another artwork. All right. We're going to go right to Michelangelo's ceiling. I put this there because Michelangelo, we're going to bring him in next week, and we're going to see how his art changes, because how the philosophy and theology and the controversies in the church, including the Reformation, really changes the artist, right? And Michelangelo is the best example because he lived 89 years. He spanned both periods. But here is a perfect... This ceiling is kind of convex, like a barrel vaulted ceiling, so it's not a nice flat one to paint. Plus they have the niches over the windows, which they call lunettes. He had a paint in there, but he planned it out. He was organized. He was following all the proper principles, right? It took him 4 years laying on his back. He also built the scaffold, and he kept it locked because he didn't want Raphael and Bramante, another artist who was the architect building the new St. Peter's. He didn't want them in there. See, Bramante and Raphael were buddies. Michelangelo didn't like them, so he didn't want them to come in. I won't get into the story because there's more than that. But go ahead. By the way, that painting is over here, Perugino's handing of the keys. Okay, look. All right, this is a schematic on how Michelangelo planned out that ceiling. And here's a color code. For example, all of the blues around the edges are Matthew 1 to 16, which are all of Christ's ancestors. All right? And then we have the different ones, right? The color codes. This is the creation. This is the creation of Adam and Eve, the expulsion from the garden, and this is about Noah. In these little squares and all, he puts down sibyls, which are pagan fortune tellers, if I can put it that way, and the prophets. We'll look at some paintings. But just, I just want to get the idea of how everything was planned. That's how they were so influenced by the art. Everything had a reason, a purpose. You see, they followed, it wasn't like medieval art. It was really experimentation and trying to be order and organized to teach things. It was all didactic. Okay, here we have the Delphic oral. If you read mythology and all, then would go to Delphi. If you read especially the Greek tragedies, we have to go to Delphi to speak to the oracle, right? That's what the Delphic Sibyl is, right? And there's 5 sibyls and 5 prophets. And then, go ahead. And then we have Isaiah. I just bring some examples. You can see there's a little linear perspective in here in the sculptor work. But this here really is not conducive for like a linear perspective as the other artworks are. Okay, next one. Okay, here's the creation of Adam, a famous painting. Right. This is Eve. This is all up on the ceiling. Eve coming from Adam's rib. Okay. All right. This is there's 2 scenes in here. Right. There's the fall and the expulsion from the garden. Okay. All right. This is it now. This here is the perfection of linear perspective. The perfection of narration, the perfection of emotion, all in one painting. Who recognizes this one?
The Last Supper.
Who is it?
Oh, the Last Supper, correct?
The Last Supper?
Yeah.
Da Vinci. Right. Okay.
Who did it? Okay.
This is Da Vinci's last. I wanted a stained glass window of it in a house, and when we had it priced out, I changed off to magnolias. All right, we've got, look, you got lines in the floor. You got the Coffered Ceiling lines. You got the wall lines. You have a horizon. And the focal point and the horizon point, of course, is Jesus, right in the center, framed by 3 windows, one with a cornice over it. Right in back of Jesus' head is the focal point and the vanishing point, because you have a horizon there. Okay, Da Vinci put the apostles in groups of 3s. So we have 4 groups of 3s. So you can actually look at one and read a little story. This particular image was like capturing one moment in time. It was the time that Christ said, truly, one of you will betray me. And the apostles, what? Who is it, Lord? You know, sorrowfully, it says in the Gospels. So we see a lot of emotion here. And there's a lot going on. And that's the narration. The close-ups, go to the next one. We'll look at the close-ups. Okay. Oh, I have back there the Gospel. This was before it was renovated by the time. It was a lot of damage. You know, the whole monastery here, it's in the refectory where the monks was blown up in the Second World War. Just that wall survived on this painting. But it was out in the weather for, a couple of years out in the elements. So a lot of things. Plus, Da Vinci used an inventive style that wasn't like the other frescoes, so it really was peeling. But anyway, they've redone it many, many times. But you can see the disciples here, who is it? What is it? There's so much in this painting. As a matter of fact, it's interesting to know who's sitting next to Jesus. On one side, we have James the senior, right? There's 2 James, James the greater and James the lesser. He's James the greater, and over there is John. Do you know their relationship? They're brothers, right? The sons of Zebedee. And if you go to Matthew or Mark, you'll see that there's 2 Gospels where the mother of the sons of Zebedee go to Jesus and says, we want to ask you a favor. Jesus says, what is it? Well, can you put my sons on either side of you? And Jesus said, you don't know what you're asking, In other words, and then he goes on, he says, if you can drink the cup. And they said, yes, we can drink the cup. He says, but it's not for me, it's for my Father. Well, Da Vinci usurped that privilege, and he put, you would think, Why? Would it be natural Peter should be on one side and perhaps James, the beloved disciple? But no, Da Vinci put the sons of Zebedee, as they requested, to be on the right and left of Jesus. Who do you think it is with his fingers up like this? Is there anything in the Gospels about somebody wanting to use his finger? How about doubting Thomas? That's Thomas. And Da Vinci says, make sure you see his finger, right? He's the one who wants to put his fist in Christ's side and his fingers in his wounds, right? Okay, go to the next one. Okay, here, of course, is close-up to see the emotion that who could be betraying Jesus, right? Who could it be, right? And this is Matthew, Thaddeus, and Simon. See, so we have narration and emotion. But Da Vinci was a master. Okay. Now, here's who's who, in case you wanted to know. And you'll see, right? Okay, we have Matthew, Thaddeus, Simon, Philip. Okay, here's James the Major, our Lord. And here is John. And notice what they put it in, not Mary, because Dan Brown said this was Mary Magdalene. But if he knew really what Da Vinci was doing, was putting the sons of Zebedee on either side, you know, he's not putting Mary there, not Mary Magdalene. Okay. So there they are. And you would think, like I say, Peter was there, but he did put Peter and Andrew together, the brothers. Right? And there's James the Minor, etc. Okay. Now, there is more, but I think we're out of time. We might have just a few minutes. I've got some more paintings, but that's really, I just wanted to get through up to here. So I'll leave that. Next week, we'll go. I'm going to do a lot on Michelangelo, both sculpture and paintings, right? Michelangelo was a sculptor. He preferred sculpting. Da Vinci preferred. As a matter of fact, they had a big debate. And there's a lot of writing on painting and on sculpture done by Da Vinci and done by Michelangelo. But we'll see how next week how that's influenced everybody. But are there any questions? Okay, let me come down so I can hear because of my hearing here.
The old adage is a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so these paintings were to depict the principles we believe as Christians.
Yes.
There was the first painting you showed us of the man who was a Muslim wearing the turban, and you had made the comment he would probably been excommunicated from the Islamic faith.
It's about Averroes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Did Mohammed see these things?
No, Muhammad was dead. Yeah, this is 700 years after Muhammad. Okay. 1400. Muhammad died 610, I think.
So this would have no bearing on his having against Christianity.
No, but there was a big debate among the Muslims over this. Averroes. Averroes had the debate himself. Say, okay. Any other questions?
Well, he was excommunicated. Yes or no? He was actually excommunicated, correct?
Well, no, he was never a Catholic.
Oh, I'm sorry. From his Muslim faith.
But he was excommunicated by the Muslims.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, if they have such a thing, they just kicked him out, by the way, he wasn't born in the Middle East. He was born in Cordova in Spain. At that time, it was called Al-Andalus, which means Islamic Spain. Spain was under Islamic rule. About 1/2 to 2/3 of Spain was under Islamic rule for 700 years, from about 711 to 1492, because it was Ferdinand and Isabella who expelled them and defeated them. Okay, and then expelled them and expelled the Jews too, by the way. All right, they were known as the Catholic Monarchs. I hate to say that. Okay, any other question? Okay, well, I thank you for coming. I look forward to seeing you next week. We'll try to tie this all together and put all together the philosophy, the art. I'll see how that philosophy and then affects the religion, and both of them together have an emotional kind of effect, a societal effect on the artwork. And the artwork also informs everybody. They do everything in a certain way, how it informs the world, and what do we call it? We call it a worldview, or ecumeny, they call it, from ecumenical. Okay. Any other questions? Okay.
Just one more, I'm sorry. In the cluster group of the three, you see there's Peter and John, and Judas is right there in the middle.
Oh, yeah, Judas is there. He's got his hand tightly around the money bag, and that's deliberately done by Da Vinci, you know. He's hanging on to that money bag.
Is there any specific as to why he would be placed between Peter and John?
Well, no, you see, if you look at half a dozen other renditions of the Last Supper by artists, they always put Judas on the other side of the table to just show, in other words, that symbolically he's an outcast. But here, Da Vinci is the only one that I know of offhand who put Judas on the same side. But he was close to Christ because he's the one who dipped in, right? They probably used to dip their bread in Christ's plate, you know. Okay, thank you very much.